What is up, everybody? Welcome to the Logic Bomb Podcast, episode 12, and we are here with another guest today. It's another dev that works on the game. Her name is Lanie Dixon. She's a user researcher for Ubisoft, specifically for Rainbow Six Siege. And we're going to talk to her today about all things that have to do with frustration and why certain things happen in the game. It's going to be really fascinating. This is really cool aspects of balancing the game that not a lot of people know much about. So with that said, let's jump into it here. Just real quick, I want to mention that you will see the camera aspect ratios change a little bit. That's due to some bandwidth issues with everybody being on the internet because they're at home. We apologize for that, but just bear with us and we'll try to fix it as we go here. But moving on from that, let's get into it here with Lanie. How are you doing? And first of all, and tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do for the team. Because again, I don't think a lot of people really understand what a user researcher does on a video game.
Yeah. Hey, well, thanks for having me. It's nice to chat with you guys. So my name's Lanie. I work at Ubisoft. I've been on Rainbow Six for coming up on about 3 years as a user researcher. I've worked solely on Rainbow in that time. So as a user researcher, this is something that's a little bit, I think, not super well known because we're obviously embedded within the dev team. But I don't possess any artistic ability whatsoever. So I'm not a designer in any sort of sense. I'm a psychologist. That's my area of expertise. We work with the design team to help them understand how their design is manifesting with our players. So my job is really understanding what's going on with players as far as whether they're understanding something, how they're experiencing it. Is it fun? Is it frustrating? How does it feel? Is it meeting the design goals that the designers wanted? So we employ different types of research methods. We science the game a bit and get some answers for them just to help them be able to make decisions about whether or not they feel confident with the design as it's being experienced by the players. So it's a bit of an interesting kind of realm within games that a lot of people aren't super familiar with, but it's really kind of an interesting way to help support the design team in being able to be in contact with our player base and our community.
With regards to, because when we spoke before, we know that you work really hard on the frustration stuff around Rainbow Six Siege and the player feedback. Is the frustration work that the surveys and analysis that you carry out, is it based solely around operators, or do you look at other aspects of the game like maps and, I don't know, barricades? You know, we had that issue recently solved. Is that something that you survey as well?
Yeah, so the frustration survey has evolved a lot in the last about year and a half that we've been doing it. It's something that goes out every season. It's something that gets sent out to a big majority of players, and the survey fluctuates a bit. So originally when we started it, it was about understanding balance of operators. It just so happened that we kind of latched on to frustration. It was something that was easy for players to get out. You know, if you dislike something and you're frustrated about it, it's a lot easier to explain.
Talk about that. It's a negative.
But it's easy. It's easy, right? It's easy to take the negative side of things and be able to start breaking down what is not working to help us understand what does work. And so we kind of reverse engineered it that way. Once we started seeing that it was working quite well with operators, we expanded the survey. So every season, we are kind of adding little things in. So in the past, we have looked at gadgets, secondary gadgets. We've looked at maps. We look at maps quite regularly. We've looked at just kind of different aspects of the game as a whole. How do you think about balance of attack? How do you think about balance of defense? So it's very broad questions, which does take us a lot of time to go through those responses, because obviously when you're getting tens of thousands of responses of open box questions, it takes a lot of time to kind of decipher what's actually being said. But yeah, we do try and look at different aspects of the game and trying to understand what little niche areas of frustration there are. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely very based in operators because that's where we are able to make a lot of those balancing changes. But we do try and take a step back and look at the bigger picture as well.
How do you weight those things? So when like frustration can be, you can be super frustrated about an operator, but they can be perfectly balanced, or something can be way too strong, but there's almost no frustration. Is one weighted higher than the other, or does it have to be a balance where you will, let's say, accept a certain amount of frustration to not make a certain thing too strong or too weak? And I assume to some extent there has to be a few things that are frustrated. Like you're never ever going to be able to remove frustration. You just want to limit it and still keep things playable, right?
Well, and I think an important thing to consider is, yes, like there's an intended frustration. So there's always going to be a intended level of difficulty, which can sometimes, that difficulty can translate for some into frustration. So it's, what's that acceptable threshold? And that's what we're always trying to balance, is that you kind of gave the example of something can appear balanced but be very frustrating. We also have a lot of the times quite the opposite. So something that appears extremely unbalanced, but as far as frustration, it's something is perceived as fair. So the way that we have tried to look at this scale is from frustration to fairness. And so we rank every operator on an aggregated score of frustration to fair. So it balances out based on how many responses are in each bucket, and it's output like a given score. So that doesn't necessarily mean that something with a low or a high fairness score means that it can't be frustrating. Those are the kind of, now we're starting to look at the qualities of it. So what quality of that operator potentially is frustrating? Is that something that we're happy with? Is it something that, what is the actual impact of the frustration? If it's something that's more impactful to a play style, it's probably going to be something that's going to be more frustrating. Probably something that we're going to want to keep an eye on and kind of look at long term. Is it something where it's a very momentary frustration, where I maybe am potentially disabled by something for a short period of time, but it's not something that lasts? That sometimes might be weighted a little bit less when we're looking at kind of whether it's something we want to address, because yes, in those 2 seconds, it's the most frustrated 2 seconds you've ever had, and you've lost control.
The lion thing.
But we have to kind of look at that on a larger picture. Yeah. It's that, is that momentary frustration balanced out by the rest of the experience? Is that in those 2 seconds, maybe you've lost control, but how do we balance that out outside of those 2 seconds? It's a lot of moving pieces coming together when we look at the whole picture, but then also an operator in isolation.
To bring
how agreeable is this across ranks? So if you go to like, you take your survey and you just look at the broad picture of everything, does the community most of the time agree? Like, let's say, whatever, 50, 60% agree with this one thing being an issue, or is it so wildly spread that it's almost impossible to say what the norm is? Like
it depends. So there's a lot of different axes that we're looking at when we're looking at the populations. So we have the general. So when we look at just everyone that we've polled for the survey, a general picture. So, choose any player, averaged out what it's going to look like. We also have different axes where we can look at your rank. So obviously when we're looking at the balancing matrix, we're looking at high level ranks. So we can compare directly that population from the frustration survey to the population that we're looking at for the balancing matrix. That's an easy way for us to see how those two are overlapping or at odds with one another. We can also look at, we talk a lot about Pro League in the survey. So we want to get an idea for who's following Pro League, how active they are following Pro League. We ask a lot of questions about what types of content creators they're looking at, which Twitch channels, which YouTube channels they're looking at. We're keeping a very close eye on those content creators and what types of content they're creating, and looking at how all of these different pieces can fluctuate. We can plug in, if it's somebody that follows Pro League a lot, we can see a shift in something that feels like it might be more frustrating. If we're thinking about bans, we can kind of look and see how those two pieces are overlying on one another. So we have a lot of different sliders that we can look at when we're thinking about different populations. So it's nice because if we want to look at people that only play in quick match, we can isolate, we can pull out those players and look as well. If we want to look at players that only play in ranked, if we want to look at players in ranked in a certain rank. So we have enough data now that we can start pulling out all of those little groups. Surprisingly, the most frustrating does seem to stay fairly consistent. But we do see slight changes, obviously, when we're thinking about how meta is shifting at higher levels. There is a meta, it's a more stable meta, so we can see how that is fitting into that. Whereas Clash is frustrating across every level. She transcends all ranks, so it's just something that we can see that there are some kind of wider trends, but then we can identify maybe something that's frustrating. If we look at a specific operator, we might see that it's very frustrating for all ranks, but what's frustrating can change. So we can look at like what perhaps is frustrating about this one in this rank, but in casual level, that might not be a factor.
It's interesting that you look at so many different things and you have to factor in so many variables. It must be almost overwhelming thinking about where to begin with that. So you look at content, what content people are watching and who they're following on social media.
How do you think I found you?
Well, I suppose that makes me wonder, to a certain degree, like for want of a better word, to what extent groupthink and sentiment plays a part with regards to what content creators are talking about, whether they're pro players, Twitch streamers, YouTube creators. Do you think that there is a real issue there with regards to content creators? And can we as content creators create issues where we talk about something that like on a sentiment level, people then believe subjectively that is a problem, but objectively it isn't? Is that something that ever comes to light?
I mean, I think that there can be the impact of that. I mean, that's why it's something that I kind of try and keep on my radar. I'm always trying to see, I'm watching Pro League. I'm trying to stay very on top of that. I'm watching what content, like the content creators that are community trusts, those are the ones that we're looking at, because in the survey, we're asking them, where do they go for information about balancing? Where do they go for information about the game? And they're putting in their favorite content creators. And so I've got this massive list of all these people that I'm just constantly checking in with and seeing what types of things that those people are talking about. Because sometimes we can see that reflected in the survey where it's, I dislike this operator, there's a problem here. So then I get responses in the survey of just like, this is shit.
Yeah.
It's like, okay.
To what degree can we blame Get Flanked for stuff? He's always on Twitter moaning and groaning about certain operators. So if we can nail him down for something, that
hashtag nerf Valkyrie.
Yes.
I do think every now and then, like, it has to be noticeable in the service to some extent that we sometimes create ghosts that might not exist.
Sure.
So we complain about a certain thing, and maybe it's just in the heat of the moment we had a bad day.
And you play a lot of the game as well, it's ironic, right?
Yeah, like exactly. So like you get frustrated about one thing, and I know how easy it is for me, especially when I was younger and watching someone I looked up to latch onto their opinion, whether or not I understood why they had the opinion, because I just backed it up, and because my favorite content creator or actor or whatever said this, so that must be true. And I'm wondering like how quickly that ripples down. Like, is there any correlation where you can go in and see like there was this outburst of something within this month or this week or these past couple of days, and then that trickles down on something you can notice, or isn't it big enough that it actually like is measurable over the community? Because I guess it is a vocal minority anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely possible. It's something that we can see. Obviously, there'd have to be strength in numbers to be able to have enough people saying something about that. But I mean, it is something that we have to look at whenever we're looking at the survey, because sometimes it's cleaning through the bullshit responses. Sometimes you get a lot of people who are like, I hate this because you took their ACOG away.
Stupid
like,
dev, fix please.
Yeah, so it's sometimes trying to look at that, but I mean, it is something that we have to factor in when we pull the numbers. We have the data that runs, and it basically outputs a chart, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is something we showed that table when we were in Barcelona about the frustration scores. So it's something, it's buried there somewhere. So we see those scores, but we're not taking that strictly at face value. We want to start reading through the comments. That's where we can start to see, is it potentially, and that's usually when I start to feel like something doesn't quite feel right here, because everybody's saying the same thing, but nobody's telling me why this is frustrating. So that's when we can start to just go to the Google and start looking at, like, I'm looking on Reddit, I'm looking at different Twitch streams, YouTube content, and be able to look and say, I suspect that maybe a comment here has blown up into something. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's not something we're going to look into. It's still something we want to, because a lot of times those quick kind of knee-jerk reactions to something of like, this is frustrating, I encountered this and that doesn't feel good, and maybe it was something I saw it happen to someone else, that doesn't discredit it as something that could be frustrating. It's now we need to be able to know what questions we can ask to identify what that problem actually could be. Sometimes it's inconclusive. Sometimes we can see that, oh, you know what? Maybe they are onto something here, and we should dig into these other variables by being able to see, if it's something that we can adjust.
It's chicken and egg too, isn't it? Because even if the content creator is like, let's just say me, for example, is known for talking rubbish on social media, and they're moaning all the time about different variables, but sometimes they might really hit on something, and just because they're talking about something, it doesn't mean that other people are talking about it because that person's spoken about it. They might genuinely have experienced it too, and it might not have had anything to do with being influenced by a content creator anyway.
Absolutely. And you have to take into consideration that a big portion of our population is not engaged with content creators online. And so it's really an interesting way to see, that's why we're asking players if they are actively seeking out information about the game. Where are they going? Because if we need to, we can push them aside and look at the people who are not actively engaged and see, are those issues still there? Sometimes they may not just be as dramatic, but we can still kind of see those popping out. So it's trying to keep those kind of potential biases in check, internally and externally, because there's a lot of kind of external forces that can be impacting it. So it's a constant just trying to balance that out. And that's why we've really created the frustration survey, because it's a good way of being able to get a huge pool of data that we can then start to look at all these different manipulations to see, hey, maybe this is something we need to dig deeper, and maybe it's something that we do need to go online and see how people are experiencing it, because we're not getting it necessarily from the survey.
Would you be able to pull out, let's say, 3 specific things that have seen actual change because of the frustration surveys? Or is
can we blame you for the Jaeger nerf?
No.
No.
Don't loop me.
Is
into
Jaeger
that.
one of those examples where something's really strong but not frustrating? I would kind of imagine that would be the case with him. Like, win delta pick rate is off the charts, but you never really died to a Jaeger and you're like, I got ripped off,
I mean, you might,
yeah.
But it's why, right? So I think we can talk about those 2 different examples. I think things that we've looked at specifically that maybe have changed from the frustration survey. I know when you guys were chatting with JB last week, the creation and the evolution of the frustration survey came from Blitz. When we tried to make Blitz more viable.
Well, you did.
We did, but then it was trying to understand exactly what was going on. And that was really when we realized that we needed to look beyond just the data points, because we could see he was frustrating. We could see there was a problem, but what exactly is there? It's not enough just to say this doesn't feel good. It's what qualities of this don't feel right and don't feel satisfying or fun or feels frustrating, and be able to break those down and say, okay, maybe let's not have a train that has a big light on the front. It's looking at what types of variables can we tweak with him, and it's, can we adjust speed? Can we adjust the timing? Can we adjust the range of the light? Can we think about how it's impacting other players? Things we've looked at. I'm just trying to look through.
Can we delete the operator?
Delete Blitz.
There's a few there. There's a few considerations.
Yeah, I think it's trying to think about operators that we're trying to look at. Obviously, we can't always fix something immediately. There's some operators that need kind of a bigger look at. I know something that we talked a bit about when we were in Barcelona was Legion. So looking a bit about what qualities of him are particularly frustrating. He falls into the pool of one rank, one population of players. He's very frustrating for one thing. In lower level rank, he's frustrating in another way, but his frustration's still quite high when you look at it as a whole. It's just the qualities are different. So it's starting to evaluate what types of changes can be made. So making some changes to Legion. Something we've been following for a long time is Jackal. He's something that we're working on. We've done a rework. We're still thinking about kind of how he falls in that bigger picture. Obviously, something we chatted about was I'd mentioned that something that's frustrating for playstyle is something that it's not as easy as tweaking some variables and saying it's fixed. It's what does that mean? How does it feel to have something that's frustrating towards the playstyle? Looking at shields, so playing against Monty, what types of changes we can look at with there. We've made some small tweaks with Cav based on some things that we've seen from the survey. I think going into the kind of Jaeger example, Jaeger is a very interesting one because obviously a lot of people have a lot of feelings, and I'm not going to go specifically into those feelings. But he is one of those that falls into the more fair side. So he does, obviously, I know exactly where he sits on the balancing matrix. And so it feels really strange to say that he actually ranks consistently the most fair. Jaeger is a very interesting example when we look at frustration and the qualities of frustration, because that's really when we can start to see what qualities of an operator make them fair and what qualities can potentially lead to frustration, and how those don't necessarily always marry very nicely together. So it's an interesting exercise in being able to break down and say, yeah, it sucks. A good Jaeger player can be very frustrating to play against, but what qualities of him are very specifically frustrating? And that's something that we're definitely keeping a very, very close eye on. But it's not always as easy and as cut and dry as it is when I'm playing against Clash. And why that's frustrating. That's we've been able to pinpoint those and be able to say, here's the list, so here's what's going on. And sometimes it's just not as easy, and it just takes a bit more time to kind of dissect that a bit.
I guess with Blitz and Jackal, it's a little simpler from like a player's perspective to like explain what it is you don't like, right? With Jackal, you always get you've been spotted and then you die, so you can like correlate that death to maybe an excuse of saying it wouldn't have happened if it wasn't Jackal. Even if there's like a whole team around you, I will still blame Jackal for me dying there. Even if there's drones, that's what I would remember. And with Blitz, when you play him, because like right now he's doing amazing on the win delta, but he's just not getting picked that much. But when you play him, you feel like you can't really do much. And when you're playing against him and he wins, you feel like you can do anything. So you have this like double loss on your end. Yeah.
It's remembering, it's like how impactful that death felt.
Yeah.
So you're always going to have, and what's interesting and something that has come out a lot from the survey, especially with Jackal, was being able to identify a lot of misunderstandings about how Jackal actually works. So when people are talking about kind of why playing against Jackal is frustrating, it was, I don't actually think they understand how his ability works. So then this is not as much as basically adjusting some variables somewhere. It's, what does this actually mean? And that's what's been helpful as well, is being able to say, I don't actually know if they understand how this ability works. We need to really evaluate that before we can just tweak some numbers and call it good, because that aspect of a misunderstanding or maybe not being fully exposed, because if I, as a new player, maybe if I encounter Jackal for the first time and I'm getting screamed at that I've been tracked and then I die, I'm not exposed to a lot. I haven't seen the fact that my footprints are going down. I haven't seen the colors. I haven't seen the gauges. I haven't seen everything. I don't know what happened. All I know, I got this really crazy UI on my screen and I was being yelled at, and then I died to Jackal. So it's looking at that. It's trying to piece. Yeah.
And like, as ironic, you're comparing him to Jaeger. I mean, like, Jaeger, like, Jackal feels oppressive, right? And Blitz, he takes away your ability, your agency to make decisions. Jaeger doesn't really. He punishes you for a bad decision. Throwing in a grenade when you haven't droned or what have you. Do you know what I mean? Like, so there is a different differentiation to be had between those two types of operators. Since Lanie, since we're talking about Jackal, since the rework, have you noticed any differences coming through about the levels of frustration, or because he still seems to be like a really highly, if not the highest banned operator in the game, certainly on the attacking team?
I mean, I think that we saw a slight change that was promising, but it's still a comfort ban for a lot of people. I mean, you've been scarred and it's going to, it's hard to recover from that a bit. I mean, I think that it's still, for some people, the qualities that are most frustrating about him are still there. He's a bit easier to understand. He's a bit easier for perhaps a Jackal player to be able to differentiate different things on his side. But there are still some qualities there for a majority of the population that still feel quite frustrating. So he is still up there, maybe not at the top every single time, but he's definitely still in the kind of overall watch section that we're keeping an eye on for sure.
On the bad boy stat.
Talking about all the very frustrating operators, what's the latest like top 5 of the most frustrating, and what are the most fair? Because I'm almost sure that they're not going to align with what the three of us, and we play very differently,
we should guess before she says.
Okay,
Yes.
I want to see.
Yes.
I want to see what your
this.
collective
Right.
guess
Pete,
is,
you go
and then
first.
I can.
Pete goes first.
Oh, so he wants us to guess, then he wants to throw me in there, like, first, like, Jesus. Okay, so I think it should be intertwined with presents. So let's quickly grab the.
Oh,
you're gonna
you're
cheat
gonna
now,
look
huh?
at.
Huh?
You're gonna look at.
What? You threw me in the deep end here. Okay, so I'm going to say. I reckon Legion's still up there, though his presence dropped about 20%. I still think that he's probably quite frustrating.
Blackbeard, Ash, Echo,
Blackbeard.
Maestro.
Yeah, I think Blackbeard, Echo, yep.
All right, my top 5 most frustrating. I'm gonna say Jackal.
It's not your top 5. It's what
Are
you
we doing a
think
collective
the
group
community.
here, or are we each like?
That's what I was
all right.
doing.
Here's mine.
It's
Top
not
5
like your
most frustrating.
personal
Jackal. I'll say Jackal, Echo. Valkyrie.
Valk.
I knew that was coming.
See, I want to say Maestro, but I don't think Maestro's in there. I don't know. Blackbeard. I don't know. This is kind of tough, actually. I thought whenever, like, initially I'd be like, no, I can do this, no problem. But, oh, Ella. I bet Ella's in top 5. Those Grismont mines are pretty frustrating. All right, I give up.
Okay.
So is this community overall, right? Like that's
what I thought we were doing.
Yeah, I hope so.
Is this polling the
Or-
community overall, or is this Plat and Diamond? Is that what you were asking, Zeronic?
I can change the variables either way. So I changed it to be so I'm looking at it right now.
Okay.
I've got it set for high rank.
Okay.
So same as the balancing matrix. So I can change it to overall. It's either
Is
or.
Ash in there?
Surprise.
Is Ash in there?
This.
That's a good question. Is Ash going to be in there? That's going to be... Okay, let's hear it.
Okay. So when we're looking at top level rank, so platinum and above for defense. So this data is from previous season. So we're in the early phases of season 1 still. So we usually let things simmer for a bit before we push out the survey. Yes.
I think Clash is going to be in there. Sorry.
Yeah,
I
Clash.
just wanted to say that. Before you read out the results.
He's so nervous about this.
So this is from the survey that we had done for last season. So obviously keep that in mind. We haven't updated it with the latest data. So this is the previous. So when we're looking at defenders, some of our top 5 right now that we're keeping an eye on would be Clash, Legion, Echo, Ella, and Mira.
Mira.
Damn, Mira.
So
Mira
Mira's
went in
banned
there
a lot.
before.
Yes.
But
So Mira is one of those interesting ones. We have a few that fall into these very kind of interesting categories where it's something that we talked a little bit about with like the perception of the content creators and kind of what I see online. Mira is a very, very interesting one when you start to move up to higher ranks, as well as people that follow Pro League. She's a very default ban in those groups of players that may not necessarily understand why Mira is banned in Pro League. This is a whole conversation that we could have for probably 45 minutes because it's very interesting to me. But it's an effect of she's banned, therefore she must not be fair. So it comes into this very strange realm of you have half of the players feeling like she's frustrating to play against because they don't know how to play against her, or they do not have the team composition unless they're playing in a 5-stack. So she's kind of falling in that bucket. You have a bucket of potentially, I see her banned. Bans must mean she's not fair. So I don't want to deal with it, but I don't really have that really complex understanding of why necessarily she's being banned in Pro League. That's a whole other kind of different aspect, but they're gravitating towards that. Whereas when we look at the lower level of play, Mira slides all the way down and we don't really see her. She's kind of in the mid pack. But when we look at the higher levels, it's something that that effect pulls her up a bit. That's not to say that she's not necessarily frustrating. It's that's an interesting effect that we do see with her specifically that we've found from the survey, and trying to understand something that we've looked at with the survey recently is trying to get an idea of why players are banning, what motivations they have for their bans, and trying to think a little bit about how players make those decisions and seeing how that can potentially impact their overall score.
It's really fun how Mira correlates so well to Pro League, where I would guess that Capital doesn't. You don't see a lot of Capital bans in high ranks, or at least not to my experience, but you see a ton of them in Pro League. It's weird how like one operator, because I mean I see it every day as well, that people go, well, we got to ban Mira because we don't have time for it, and like there's this whole thought process of we're playing a Pro League match, even though we're just 5 people in solo queue, right? And we know well enough what to do and how to deal with it. But Mira gets banned, but Capital never does. And arguably, he's just as big of an issue in a good 5v5. Yeah. He pulls as much weight as Mira does, but it doesn't translate to that attacker.
I think an interesting fact with Mira, so something we've been trying to look at is trying to be able to kind of group and prioritize the frustrations. So Mira is an interesting one in that where typically one of the priorities of frustration is counters. So if something's going to be frustrating, there's pretty good odds that what's going to be frustrating is either I don't feel like there's enough counters, I don't understand them, I have to have specific utility, I have to plan ahead, or I have to be able to have this deeper level understanding of the game to feel like I can counter that. or how it kind of counters me. I think Mira potentially can fall into that weird kind of potential kind of gray area between a lot of those kind of buckets where it's, I don't understand how to counter this, or she's countering my general strategy, or it's also trying to think about, is there's certain map bans, if obviously she's going to be much stronger in some maps, some sites. Obviously we're not digging that deep in the survey necessarily, but it's something that we would look into when we see her pop up this high. We would want to say, okay, let's start looking at the data on that specifically.
I mean, I kind of understand it. I mean, there's no other defender where you come around a corner, oh, there's a mirror window, well, I'm not going that way. You know what I mean? There's really no other situation in the game like that. Now, there's plenty of counters to that, you know, whether it's going above or below or a Habana or Twitch or whatever. But there is like that feeling of, I come around a corner and, oh, there's a Mira. Okay, I can't go that way. And that's kind of frustrating. Yeah. Especially if it's in the last minute of a round or something.
Yep.
Did the deployable shield lower that at all? The frustration? The new...
I would have to look at some other things that I don't have in front of me to see that.
Fair enough.
Mira's kind of been not really a major concern. She's something that we've been watching, but she has been hovering in the acceptable range for a while. So I'd have to double check with how the I'd have to look at past seasons and identify when that came in, but I don't have that in front of me. Sorry.
With Ella being in the top 5 defenders there, but also recently getting a buff, does that mean that you lost an argument with somebody? Like, I mean, like they're looking at buffing her. Are you going to be like, well, hold on a second, guys, why are we buffing a top 5 most frustrating defender right now?
Well, I think it's also understanding what qualities of her are frustrating. So if we did want to make a change, whether it was a nerf or a buff to any operator, what we'll usually do is have a conversation about what qualities of her are very frustrating. The Scorpion wasn't necessarily something that was popping up. I mean, I think we can all have this maybe personal bias assumption that there is something there, but it wasn't necessarily coming out in the data itself. We've been following her for a bit. I think the interesting thing is when you look at the scores, while she is up there, she hovers quite closely to the kind of even boundary of acceptable frustration. Even though she's in the top 5, those top 3 have kind of skewed the data so heavily that we're pulling up some that maybe are less of an issue into the top 5. But Ella is an interesting one because obviously she's one of those that's frustrating for different reasons at different ranks. So if you have the higher level of gun skills, once you kind of are moving up to higher ranks, your frustrations are latching on to different qualities of Ella. If you're looking at something at a lower level rank, you're more frustrated by, I'm not seeing the mines. I don't understand what this thing is. A lot of the times I'm experiencing something, but I don't necessarily know that I hit a Gersmont. It's difficult for me to know when it was a Gersmont versus maybe something else if I don't quite know that. So it's looking at which qualities are there and kind of if we're making a change. I know this is something that you guys discussed. It's something that's moving on with kind of the balancing notes and kind of how we're thinking about the designer's notes and the kind of the intentions behind changes is being able to identify why this change is being made and for who. So which audience. So it's something that we keep into consideration when we're looking at the different operators and which qualities are overlapping in the different populations. And maybe perhaps it's something that we need to fix for higher level play or for rank play, but it's not necessarily addressing the issue for other players. I wouldn't say I necessarily lost an argument, but we've been closely following it.
The thing with that, though, is I suspect it might have been the FO12, because I think that was a very big issue, particularly on console. Getting hit, sprayed down with the FO12 shotgun.
100%.
So you gave us the top 5 there, and unfortunately for flanked, we didn't see Valkyrie
I'm sure she's
in there. I'm
6.
sorry.
She's 6. Don't worry about it. Dude. It's all good. And
Well,
Lanie, no need to confirm. I'm sure Valkyrie's 6. We'll just keep moving on
make
here.
that assumption.
She's very far to the other side.
Oh no.
Does that mean we lost an argument there, Frank?
I was wondering, is that all playing against those operators, or is there any factor there with playing as those operators?
So what we've typically looked at right now is playing against. So we are historically, when we've looked at the survey, it's playing against these operators. What we've done over the last 3 seasons now is we've added, so for our new operators coming in, we've added specific questions for them. So this last season, we specifically looked at other aspects for Kali and Wamai. So we're asking how it feels to play as on a team with. And so we're adding a few other variables. We can't have all of that data on all of the operators going back to the end of time, but it is something that we're exploring for the newer ones because we can kind of capture that initial experience with them. So it's something that we're trying to look at because it was a factor when we think about Goyo. It's something that we think about when we're playing as, with, or against. There's some interesting different little things that are going on there. And it was something that when we're thinking about how we want to balance him, it was something that we really discussed is if we're making a change, it's which aspect is it changing? Is it me playing against a Goyo shield? Is it me playing as Goyo? And how does it feel also as being a teammate dealing with one of those shields?
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
That's a really good point about the third person, the teammate that is playing with that. Because I've never considered that as like an issue. Because if you're playing with 5 people and you're communicating, then it's not that frustrating, right? Because you can ask your teammate not to do it. But in a solo queue experience, yeah, I mean that could be major frustration to have a teammate. Maybe it's Cav just running away, leaving all the time, or
exactly.
Maybe it's a Goyo shield that fries half of your team, right? Or whatever it might be. And Wamai just placed in the middle of the site, and now everyone,
Yeah, because Goyo was actually the reason that prompted me to start thinking about we should start asking this, because when we specifically, so basically the way that the survey works is that the players can kind of drop downs. They can choose their top 3. They answer a bunch of questions about them. And then we take all that data and we aggregate it. But when we have the new season coming out, we specifically have dedicated questions where you have to answer of like, either I haven't played against them or whatever. So it's like, here's Goyo, what's going on? And we had only really captured playing against Goyo. But then when I started going through the comments, something that continually came out was playing with. Or teammate was a word that got flagged. And it was like, okay, so I'm looking at all of the responses that have been flagged with teammate and I'm reading through them all. And I was like, we've got some other issues potentially going on here with frustration, is that teammates aren't knowing when it's a Goyo shield. They're not knowing, or they're being surprised because they want to hold this very specific angle. And now they have a Vulcan shield next to them. And then that gets blown up. And now I feel frustrated because my teammate has done something. So it may not necessarily be something that we can change immediately, but it is something when we want to think about changes for Goyo, it was something that we wanted to start thinking about. Again, you mentioned Wamai, same thing. So then when I went to the next survey and we're thinking about, okay, I'm going to add that question in as well. So what's kind of some of the issues with Wamai and what are some of his frustrations? And yeah, sure enough, some people are frustrated because they didn't expect a magnet to be in the middle of the site where they were holding, or a good intentioned teammate might have tried to put a magnet above somebody and then something fell on top of them now and they didn't know, they didn't hear it. So it's trying to look at all of those different things that could potentially factor in. So when we do want to make a change, we have as much data that we can give to the team and say, okay, that's great that you want to fix those things, but what's the impact that it could potentially have? Is it addressing this? Is that a top priority? Is it enough to say we need to prioritize that because it's impacting synergy of a team? It's impacting the way that I feel on site and how that could potentially have a more frustrating experience, let alone the opposing side.
Yeah.
I get frustrated
really
when my teammates play Goyo, and for many of the reasons that you mentioned there. But there's also the fact that like if I'm playing Legion and I want to put my Legion trap on a door, and then the Goyo puts a shield there later, like that's very likely to get dealt with by some type of explosive, which means it's going to wipe out my goo mine as well. Because I'm not playing on a stack that's coordinated enough to have ADS protection or any type of barrier to other than just that shield in itself. So I can see that in a lot of ways, like the frustration. Like I never really thought about it before, but I do kind of like when a teammate picks Goyo, I'm kind of like, yeah.
But it's fun because we all know it when we think about like when we started playing Siege and we had this teammate Castle who barricaded us inside.
Yeah,
right? That's exactly what happened.
Yeah, it's the same case.
Or the guy who placed barbed wire next to the Capcan trap. You're like, if he walks through the Capcan trap, the barbed wire's gone.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So we all know it and have experienced it tons. I've never really thought about it.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily it's something that we're looking at. It's difficult because we don't always have a response for that.
Mm-hmm.
It's not always something like, yes, we're going to fix it by doing this.
Remove the teammates.
But it's important to be able to we're trying to get a full picture, and it takes time because obviously there's so many team compositions, maps, sites, all of this that factor in, whereas sometimes we might get a bump in something because somebody learned a cheeky angle somewhere and now it's all over the internet and everyone's very frustrated about that one situation, but it's aggregating over time. So as we continue to build and build and build, we can really see that now after a year and a half, we can be a bit more precise, and we can start to think about maybe in 6 months from now, I'll have more information about how we can think about frustration with a teammate's operator. And potentially maybe there is something that we can consider, maybe not. It's hard to say, but it's definitely something that we're really trying to educate ourselves and be as in the know on as many of those things as possible, because they are very important for the experience, and it's something that we want to take into consideration, whether we can explicitly address it or not. It's something that we need to be able to be conscious of to make that decision.
What was the top 5 attackers?
All right,
Ashe,
so top 5,
Ashe, Ashe, and Jackal.
Blackbeard will be up there.
Okay, so I'm going back. Let me just bump it back up.
Jackal, 100%.
Monty might be on there.
Okay.
While you look,
All right, let's hear it.
Top 5?
Yeah, let's hear it.
Yeah.
All right. Blackbeard, Monty, Jackal, Ashe, Blitz.
Wow.
Damn.
Is it that surprising?
I
Is
mean,
it that
it kind of
surprising?
is. The shields got nerfed into oblivion. I mean,
That's true.
oblivion. It is really difficult to kill somebody with Blitz or
With-
Monty.
with-
right
Yeah,
now.
but- ADS
so
time.
so I think like when you talk about the shield, the problem is when you're playing against people that know how to play a shield, you get destroyed and you feel absolutely powerless. When this car door comes walking in the room, and I don't care how good you are, if the multiplayer is as skilled as you and he has a teammate, you're against an unkillable drone that is
Yeah.
going to full shove into a corner and you will die.
Right. Yeah. I think
that will make you
at the end
furious.
of the day, it is if I kill a Blitz by shooting his feet while he's sprinting at me 10 times and die to him once, I remember the once that I died to him.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's
I mean,
just,
it's the same with cheaters, right?
yeah.
You can have 10 good games, but you will remember the one game there was a cheater in that day. Like, that'll stick with you for a week. You're going to remember that game.
Yeah, and I think one thing that we're always trying to look at, I think especially with Monty, because obviously there have been a lot of changes. So we had the changes directly because of the results from the survey. So we saw that he was frustrating, made a change, and now we're watching to ensure that change had the intended effect. It takes a lot of time to see that reflected in the data. I'll be curious to see what happens with season 1 and even moving into season 2, if it's something that we start to see it level out. Just because historically what we've seen, it takes a while, because those memories, you'll remember them for a long time when you die to that. So it takes a while for you to be able to kind of move past that. So one thing that we try and do specifically, so we've seen Monty, he's there. We're still analyzing him and we're still watching him, because we want to see, are we getting the same comments? Because now have we made a change that now has unleashed something else? Or is it that maybe you are frustrated, but you maybe haven't encountered Monty since that change came? Maybe these are not active people that aren't actively seeking out balancing information. Maybe they don't know that there was a change. So it's possible that for them, it's still the most frustrating, and that doesn't discredit it in any way. It's that now we can see, okay, perfect. These people still feel like this is an issue. We agree. We've done this. We're going to keep watching. So now when I'm pulling up and I'm analyzing the data, I'm looking at dates. I'm looking at, okay, what changes have been made? Are people still complaining about it? And, have we seen changes in pick rate? Have we seen changes in the presence? What is that looking like? Sometimes we can see a change in one season. Sometimes it takes a few. So it's definitely, I anticipate that that will just be something that we're going to have to follow, because shields are just frustrating. And maybe that experience was enough that you just don't move on for a while. It's possible.
Have you had any spike in frustration on something that you simply cannot find out why? Or do they all kind of in some way make sense, or can trickle down to a certain thing?
I'm double checking, but I'm pretty sure that sometimes it didn't feel obvious at first.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes it was, okay, I understand why this is frustrating, but why now?
Yeah.
I think that was something interesting that we saw with Jackal. We knew it was frustrating, but then all of a sudden, one season, he went from like 6th to 1st, and then he just stayed there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And we weren't entirely sure. I don't know that I can really entirely say for certain why, because there wasn't necessarily a change that was made. But, I remember seeing all of a sudden Blackbeard moving up. So poking, somebody on the dev team and being like, what did you do? And being able to understand exactly, because I was seeing comments and I couldn't necessarily match that on to a very specific change, because it was a very, it was the like ADS refactor, the animation refactoring. So it was difficult at first for us to see how that was manifesting based on the comments, because players weren't entirely sure. It was something that was kind of the asterisks at the bottom. And so a lot of people didn't know. And so they didn't understand what was going on. But then just Blackbeard's just like going up, 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 up. So it was, okay, what's going on? I think being able, sometimes it takes a while, because we have to take into consideration what new operators came out this season. Do they synergize really well with somebody? What's going on? Did we see the pick rate go up in something? So that changed. So if we released a rework or a new operator, we got to be very mindful of how that looks. We're not going to take the immediate score. We're going to watch that. And we're going to double check and see what happened. But I think for the most part, as far as the frustration goes, it's typically pretty clear cut. What gets a little bit harder is being able to qualify exactly what's on the other end. So really being able to qualify what specifically makes this very fair, and how can we use this information in the future. So being able to predict potentially things that could be frustrating, and kind of reverse engineering that, and being able to understand what feels fair to people, and how can we take that information to learn and grow as a team, because this is something that is very intertwined with our design team, we're very close in being able to sit and talk with them. They have this all bookmarked and they have it and they're looking at it regularly. It's something that we look every time we talk about balancing. And so it's being able to think about, kind of what can we learn and how can we move forward and basically say, we're going to take the risk of this potentially being frustrating because it's this momentary thing rather than this 20-second experience of being really frustrating. We're going to take that risk and say, we're going to make this design decision, knowing potentially that there could be this momentary frustration, but we're going to ensure all of these other aspects are not high on that ranking.
Do you think, given time, then, that the shield operators on that top 5 may drop off the top the top 5 most wanted? Do you think that's a possibility?
It's hard to say. I think that it's difficult to look at the whole range of players. Potentially, if you're looking at maybe higher ranked, I could foresee a possibility of it moving down. I think once you move into potentially players that are still learning, are still trying to get a grasp on composition, understanding how to deal with shields, feeling like you can be aggressive enough to get up into a shield and melee them or anything like that. Like, that's just because those changes have been made doesn't necessarily mean that a player is going to take that risk. So for them, it's that I still might feel that's frustrating because I know for me, I'm never going to put myself in that position to be able to get that close because I don't feel confident or I don't feel comfortable or maybe I don't even know.
There also has to be a level of accepted frustration when it comes to that, right? Because even if you push them all the way down, something else is going to be the most frustrating thing. So
100%.
I guess it's more about, as long as you as a player feel like you had a choice in the matter and you could in some way, shape, or form touch the outcome of it and have something to say, then you might be frustrated, but at least before you lose your marbles, you know that you could have done something.
Yeah.
That helps a lot, right?
100%. And it's being able to identify what that threshold is for different ranks, for different populations. And that's what's been really insightful from looking at all of these responses for different populations. It's being able to say, we've accepted that this quality of this operator might always be frustrating. However, are there small levers that we can tweak to make it feel a bit better? But maybe that doesn't ever change the fact that it's always going to be frustrating. It's possible that's the way that it stays.
It's really curious.
There's something interesting to... Sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Pete. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that there's something interesting about... We've got some of the most frustrating operators, but they're quite low on presence. Like, for example, Clash. Some of those shield operators like Montaigne, you don't see them particularly often. And even Legion, like we've seen his presence drop since the last, but nerf to his ability, which I would argue some of the most frustrating parts of his ability still remain, but arguably by reducing his presence, you reduce the amount of how often you're going to run into those frustrations. So I think it's an interesting concept that you can actually have an operator that you rarely ever see, but like they are super duper the most annoying arsehole you're ever going to run into in game.
Well, and that's basically why we're doing this, is that we recognized that making balancing decisions from the presence and the pick rate alone wasn't enough to be able to help us feel as though we had the full picture. Because obviously, if we were only going from that, there'd never be any reason to nerf or change Clash, for example, which is what you just said, is that her presence rate isn't that high. But we see her time and time again kind of popping up on the frustration survey. So for us, it's that, it's allowing us to have the whole picture so that the designers can make more confident decisions about which balancing changes they do want to make, rather than just making them on that alone, because we've seen in the past how that's been problematic. And we're learning because we have a very robust way of getting all of this data. And as we mature and as our balancing team matures, we can be able to have these different facets and levers that we can look at as well to make those decisions.
As a follow-up on that question then, Lanie, do you ever say, look, okay, this operator is ridiculously frustrating, but they're not particularly balanced, and let's face it, you only see them so rarely anyway. Like, the presence is so ridiculously low, like Clash or whoever. We're just not going to touch them because we accept they are a frustrating operator. They're in the top 1 or 2 every season. But, like, realistically, you're not running into them every match.
I mean, I think it goes back to a little bit of kind of what Zoronic was saying, is that you accept this level of frustration, or you kind of sometimes have to. It's that Clash is a very interesting example in that sense, where she's frustrating to play against. No one's going to deny that that's the case. And she has she's obviously on the lower end. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're okay with that. It's just sometimes we have to prioritize what we can do, and looking at the qualities of what is frustrating and how easy that is to change. Because just because we can easily identify what's frustrating doesn't necessarily mean that we can make those changes quickly. It's not necessarily a balancing change. Can we go in and tweak some variables? Can we go in and say this many charges versus a reduced amount of charges? Is it changing the damage of a weapon? Is it looking at those types of things that can be quite easy to adjust? But then sometimes if we have kind of bigger fundamental issues, it's not something that we can change in the course of a couple of weeks. Sometimes it's something that we have to think about as a longer picture and looking at the priorities of the team, because it's always going to be a toss-up of evaluating where they're falling and how easy it is to be able to make those changes. Because we don't want to just make a quick change and push it out and just say, okay, here you go. We're trying to make those meaningful choices and meaningful decisions. So it's not quickly just kind of saying, okay, do this.
Clash is a little nuclear though, because seeing as she's been deactivated so many times and there's been so many glitches with her as well, I think she's one of those operators where a lot of people just think back to that, and like that might piss you off, even if she isn't actually doing anything to you in game, right? Because you have a good handful of ways to counter it and do something. But the one time where you're left in a 1v1 with Clash and it's like this big bully holding your head away and you can't touch them, that's super annoying, right? It's just it's rare that you actually get into that situation, but the feeling lasts so long.
Yeah. Well, it's something that we have to watch when we're looking at the comments. Is it something that's related to, I had this 1v1 interaction and that's always going to stay with me forever? Or is it there are other issues? And sometimes it's not. Sometimes we have to watch them for a season or two to be able to identify what those issues are. Because if we're getting in the survey like, this is shit,
Best
right.
feedback ever.
It's like, all right, cool. So sometimes I just have to say, okay, I don't have anything. I think there's an issue, but let's look at, so I go to the data team and I'm saying, okay, I don't see a change in a recent patch notes. I don't see anything explicit that we've done. They're popping up on the frustration. Can you think of any reason? So then it's digging. And sometimes it's like, oh shit, yeah, there is an issue here. Is it the issue that was addressed from the survey? We don't necessarily know, but we're going to watch it. And so we kind of add that to the like, all right, let's watch it for a few weeks, see if something happens. If it pops up again on the next survey, let's try and see if we can evaluate by adding some questions into the survey, because sometimes we'll add specific wordings of things to try and get at, frustrations with team compositions, kind of trying to see if there's these kind of underlying layers that we can potentially help lead us to okay, yeah, let's look at the data points on this, and maybe that'll help us kind of see what the root issue is.
I think the big thing I take away when I look at like the collective top 5 defender and attacker with frustration is people don't like feeling helpless. You know, you look at Echoes, you know, with an invisible yokai drone that you can feel helpless against it. You look at Clash, you look at Monty. That's kind of the Jackal, even to a certain degree, you can feel kind of helpless. So I guess first of all, that do you see that reflected in the comments as well? And second, how much are the game designers taking that into account for new operator design? Like, does that mean that the next operators that we get are very, very unlikely to feature anything that would make you feel helpless? Is that part of the discussion that's going into this, like with new operator design?
Yeah. So getting to the first point. So one thing that we've been trying to do is really aggregate all of this information into a model, I guess, if you want to call it. So that's what I've been working on for about a year, is aggregating all of the responses and being able to prioritize what's frustrating, like separate from a given operator. So if you just look at a frustrating operator, what's most likely to come up first, and being able to kind of map out all of the different kind of possibilities that are there. So I had mentioned like before, like counters. So whether it's they aren't there, I don't understand them, or there aren't enough, those are kind of 3 separate sub questions that we can look at. So we're trying to prioritize what those facets are and what fits into each of those facets. It's an ongoing project. I'll probably work on this until the end of time, but it's something that I'm looking at every single survey, and we're building on it. Moving into the next portion of the question is, what does this mean for new operators? It's something that we are actively talking about when it comes to new operators. It's what have we learned? So it's looking at the frustration facets and saying, okay, what's the accepted threshold of frustration? Is it that, yes, there's frustration, but maybe you're not hitting these other facets? So something that I've been trying to do for a long time is finding the connections between different qualities of frustration. So correlating bits of saying, you know, if I'm really frustrating for a play style, so if my operator ability impacts the play style of my opponent, there's other connected facets to that I want to make sure I'm not hitting. And when I'm saying not hitting, it's that I don't want to have a kind of warning in those facets. So it's an ongoing conversation with the design team and being able to say, okay, we know that this major facet's frustrating. What potential qualities would we have in this operator? Mapping this out, mapping that out, and then we're rapidly doing internal testing. So is it an acceptable threshold that we're okay with? Because that's fine too. Sometimes we can be okay with it, but it's really trying to look at, okay, what does this mean long term? Is it going to be reflected immediately? No. It's not something that we can just say like, we did it. I wish it was, but it's something that we're actively being very cognizant of and saying, okay, what have we learned collectively? Not even just in frustration, but looking at the whole balancing picture. It's being better with communication, ensuring that we're being transparent about what we're doing. It's being aware of what the community is saying and taking that into consideration, and not just, this is garbage, I don't like it. It's, okay, what's the issues there? Taking that time to really ensure that we're making confident decisions, and how that reflects in future operators is obviously down the line, and whatever that looks like is, because I'm not directly involved in that, but I can support them by saying, you know, here's some things that we found that are frustrating, just so you know. And they're very open to, we don't want to make similar mistakes if we don't have to, or we're okay with, we've seen that this potentially can be frustrating, but we feel confident because we've adjusted it in the following ways. It's allowing them to make informed decisions when they're doing that.
It's funny how you don't see something like Pulse stand out, right? On the frustration meter, because I mean he can scan anyone through any wall at quite a long range, and he isn't something, at least I don't think I've ever really heard anyone complain about him. Like
in the beta and alpha.
Yeah. I mean, back then he could scan you in the backyard of another map. But I think if someone like him came out now, you'd have a spike until we got used to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I guess the question is, like, how long does it take for us on average to kind of come to terms with, okay, this is probably how it's going to be, and does things then drop off on the frustration? Because if Jackal is still as frustrating as he's always been, and we've seen a spike come out of pretty much nowhere, I guess that's probably when Lion got played a little less, Jackal took over, and then Dokkaebi took over after, or something like that. But do we at some point just as players look at it and go, okay, this is how it is. Now we've learned these things we can do against it, and then the frustration drops, or does it kind of stay the same?
I think it depends on which operator you're speaking of. I think that it's normal to expect that it would take some time to fall off. It's also very difficult when, like, if you're looking at Jackal and he has a frustrating ability, he also has a really good kit.
Yeah.
He's got good weapons. And so, when we're looking at what's going on, we remove Ash ACOG. Suddenly, Jackal kind of trickles his way back up again because we've got some things kind of going down. That frustration with the ACOG and specifically with Ash kind of sidestepped a little bit, but then something else has to come in. Something else has to kind of float up to the top, like we were talking earlier. So it's trying to evaluate, okay, is it something that potentially is going to change? Sometimes it might just take a while. It's difficult. I mean, we're still relatively fresh in this. We have a lot of operators. And when you think about in a given day, how much people are playing, how many operators they're encountering, we have to ensure that we're giving it time to level out. How much time does that take? It's variable, and we're still trying to be very aware of that, because it's not a foolproof system, and I mean that's okay. It's education, and it's trying to be open that we're keeping a very watchful eye on it, and sometimes it's just not as easy to say, let's just change this. It's that maybe if an operator is frustrating and they hit high in a lot of different facets, maybe something major has to be done, but that major something that has to be done, that also takes time and resources away from another project and resources away from another fix. So it's this constant, what feels frustrating and is detrimental versus something that maybe feels frustrating, but we're going to look at something that feels maybe a bit more broken in the perception, and ensuring that experience is still fun. And we're learning, we're always trying to look at what, learning from the decisions that we've made, and maybe thinking what was a mistake, but what wasn't, and trying to think about what the acceptable is and how long things will go. Because I think there's a lot of operators. If you fix something else is going to pop right back in.
Absolutely.
And so it's sometimes we nail it right on the head, and that thing that was frustrating just kind of goes away. And other times things kind of just float up, and something that's new, like you were saying with Pulse. I mean, it's hard to say. I think it'd be interesting to see what that would feel like if he came out today.
That would be.
I mean, obviously not the like spotting somebody from matchmaking, but it's like, you want to be able to think about that ability, and it's difficult because there's so many pieces that go into it when you're thinking about team compositions and maps and ranks, and what I've seen online and how I understand the ability. If I don't understand something, that factors into, and so it's a very interesting aspect of how all of these pieces kind of come together.
To bring this to the game right now, there's a very controversial patch that JB talked about at length last week on the podcast.
Yes.
Is there anything in that patch that you can point to and say this is based upon data that we've gotten back from the frustration survey, or is this patch mostly dealing with the other kind of two factors of balance, with regard to the win deltas and the Pro League feedback?
I mean, I think it's tricky because I think when you say whether the frustration survey had an impact or not, it may not necessarily be that we made a decision to fix something that was frustrating, but we made a decision because there was no issue. If we say we're going to make a decision and we want to make a change, but we don't see anything in the frustration survey, we can't necessarily say like, yeah, go ahead. It's that, all right, we're going to make that choice and we're going to keep an eye on it. So it's not necessarily that we were fixing something that was frustrating, but maybe sometimes we're making a change and it wasn't necessarily something that was on our radar. We'll find out soon enough.
Well,
but,
it's right? Like the Goyo Shield, that hit on a massive frustration point that might not, like a lot of times that's from everything from casual to pro. When we use the word balance, we're talking about frustration and not actual balance. And it's very rare that we have the numbers or the data as players to really understand like what's it gonna matter if we remove this thing or that thing. But it's very easy to see that this thing sucks to play against.
Yeah.
Or that's the feeling you get when you play, right?
Yeah, it's looking at how all of those pieces fit together. It's Siege. It's an incredible, just huge piece that we have to always be looking at because we have all these different populations of players playing different versions of the game. We're all playing different meta. We're all doing different things. We're choosing things for specific reasons. We're going to be frustrated about a lot of the same things, but we're going to be frustrated about different things sometimes. And so trying to keep the peace in all of those realms, it's an interesting kind of thing to look at because when we talk about balance versus frustration, that's a big piece of it for a lot of people. But then there's also the fact that we have a lot of numbers that we're looking at and a lot of other people that are much smarter than me looking at a lot more deeper data than I am, who are saying that they want to balance it out based on these other aspects. And that's great. It's just this constant team effort to look at all these different data points and say, we're going to make this decision and we accept all of these different pieces, how they fit together. Sometimes we nail it on the head. Sometimes it's, all right, now we know that this is not a possibility, but we're always going to be moving forward to ensure that it's something that we're aware of. And it may not necessarily be something we can fix immediately, but when we think about the frustration, it's something that we take it very seriously, and it's something that it's very important to our team. And it's not always as easy as just flipping a switch.
Is it so we can't necessarily hold you to account for the Ying buff then.
No.
For our audio listeners, there was a shake of the head. So to follow on from Flank's question, really just about how frustration fed into this latest set of changes into the game. Mm-hmm. And also, I mean, you covered it earlier, really, with what JB said last week about transparency around why these changes are made. Do you think there will ever come a time where frustration surveys and some of this data that we've talked about today will be published along with those designer notes? So, for example, we get the designer notes with the presence and the win ratio, but maybe we also see like what people are finding frustrating. Do you think there's any merit to that, or could that create like a problem?
I mean, I think it just depends on the change, right? I think it's being open about why we're making a change. If we're making a change based on something that came from the frustration survey, I don't see any reason why we couldn't share that specific aspect of it. I don't know that it's necessary to just blast it all the time because there's so much there. But if we're making a change because of it, I don't see why we couldn't have that. It's not up to me. But obviously, it's something that we're having those conversations. If it's a driving factor, then yeah, I think that we can be transparent and say, yeah, this is something that we found from the community survey. This is some of the comments that we saw. This is how we have opted to address that.
Yeah, I can see the benefit in it myself, because I think it might help shape opinions, and I certainly class myself as top of this list of people that, make like really ignorant comments sometimes. Well, hopefully in the past, obviously since our first meeting, about why these changes are made in the game. And I think it will inform opinions a little bit to see, this other aspect of the game. That if this was sort of published periodically to say, oh, look, like people are finding these things frustrating, then maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is why we all went to Barcelona, right? I mean, I think that this was something. I started doing the survey about a year, almost 2 years ago, I guess now, and started seeing, you know what? There's a big disparity between the way that we talk about balancing and the community talks about balancing. What can we do to that? What can we do for that? So I went to the comm dev team and I said, hey, I feel like we could do some community education here. And I feel like we could be really transparent about what's going on. And that really evolved to, where are people going for this information? It's that we're trying our best to put this information out on the website, but if nobody goes and looks at it, might as well not even exist. So it's, what's out there, what can we do? And that's been something that we've been trying to work on. We want to chat with you guys. We want to do things like this because it's not for lack of not wanting to share it. It's that, sometimes we can put things up. There's a lot of people moving this game forward, keeping it live, keeping everything functioning on a day-to-day basis. It's hard to be able to have that information out in front of everybody, but I think that it stands that doing things like this and talking about it just helps people to know that, it's not that we're not listening. It's not that we don't care. It's not that we don't have the information. It's that it takes time sometimes. And I think being able to educate directly by us being here talking, sharing information with people like you guys, and you can go out into your communities and you can share that information and be able to say, it's not justifying, it's just basically it's education and saying this is the process and this is what it looks like. And we're not trying to hide that. It's that there's just a lot going on and it's hard to be able to give all of that information with context to be able to make sure that it's understood to some degree.
That definitely helps with frustration from my perspective. Just knowing that there is some sort of acknowledgement to things happening or things being looked into, not even looking for a time frame or a fix, but just knowing that somebody is. And I mean, sure, we know somebody's doing something, but just having someone say that means more to people than I think we realize.
Yeah, and that's the hope. I mean, and I think that that's something that we recognized that there was a gap that we could fill. And it wasn't something as complicated as trying to make fancy tables and put big, huge things. It's that it's having the conversation and helping people understand. And, we can't sit down with every player and be like, look, it's, we need to try and teach people and have that education get out there and say, it's very important to us. And it's something that we're constantly trying to revamp the way that we're doing things, become more efficient, and ensuring that we can evaluate things in a proper manner. And it's something that we're looking for. So
I know we're running a little bit close to the end time here, but I'd like to talk a little bit about what people are saying regarding map frustration. Do you have the capability to list the top 5 most frustrating maps similar to you did with operators, or just off the top of your head, do you know what you hear consistently regarding frustration when it comes to maps?
Yeah, I think maps is something that we're still trying to get at. It's been something that we've been looking at for a long time. When we're looking at the maps that are chosen for the casual pool, right? So we're looking at quick match and the maps that are there. We can kind of help guide the team to, hey, if this map is kind of this map is frustrating, favela. I mean, I think that there's the maps that we all kind of can suspect that potentially could be frustrating, but it's trying to understand what those are. So lessons that we're trying to look at, we do a lot of work with our pro players, obviously, who have extensive map knowledge, and we're getting feedback from them. But when we're looking at the community, where's the overlap? It doesn't feel so great when there's a window right onto site. It's those types of things where it varies for different types of players, but trying to look at map layouts, how sites are positioned, where they're positioned in a building, how many different sites there are, where the spawn points are, thinking about opportunities for spawn peeking, runouts. It's a lot of those that we're trying to build up. It's very deep, and we've spent a lot of time looking at operators that I hope that one day we can get more and more information for maps, but it's a lot. And it's really trying to understand level design to a level that I probably don't possess. But being able to help our level designers in saying, when they have specific questions of, we're thinking that there might be something off with this site. Can you look and see if this map came up as frustrating, if this site was mentioned? Sometimes we'll look at specific maps and say, hey, of these 4 maps, which site feels frustrating and why? So simple things, if we're thinking about sites being on different levels, that's something that can potentially lead to frustration. How closely sites are positioned, how many safe locations. Do I have enough reinforcements to set up a site where I feel safe? And that's going to vary depending on your level, because maybe some ranks you just want to open everything up and it doesn't matter. But at lower ranks, maybe you just want to reinforce everything because that's just what feels safe. So it's something that does kind of vary. But it's an interesting topic that I hope that we can continue to push on in the future.
I'm not sure there's any data on this yet, or if you even have a way of noticing it, but all chat on or off, is there any way for you guys to see if that has any impact on frustration? Because you implemented the one where it defaults to team only now. And I think it's one of the best small changes that have come to the game in a very long time.
I agree.
I think it should be forced. I don't think you should even be able to turn it on, but I'm also very extreme and I get that. But I would assume that it's default a better experience for most people, and there has to be like some higher reason for it being implemented to start with, because it is a change.
It's a change. It's not something that I can speak to directly. It wasn't something we covered directly from the frustration survey.
Right.
From a user research perspective, it's something that we've chatted with the team, but it's not anything related to the kind of when we think about frustration and that picture. It wasn't something that we did there.
Fair enough.
Are you guys
glad to hear you're happy with the change?
I really
it is one of the best changes, I think, that goes kind of unnoticed. Do you guys have any other questions for Lanie here, or are we about ready to wrap this up?
One quick one, Flank. When you have a shit day, do you get home and then go through your paperwork and think, right, I am going to be hang on, today I'm playing Clash and I'm playing Legion and I'm taking it out on the world because I have had a bad day? Does that happen? No.
I went through a period of time where I was playing Clash a lot because I wanted to feel like what it felt like to play and understand what it was.
That's fair enough.
So obviously I'm not very good, so I was dying immediately. I didn't have the effect, but no, it's
just trying
it's
to
definitely
the numbers.
No, I think it's playing kind of different things. I think it's always been really interesting to see the comments about how people are playing it and going into a game and dying because I'm standing in the corner too long, analyzing the situation that's around me. That's frequently usually how it goes.
All right. Well, I seriously, I appreciate you coming on, Lanie. I mean, this is
Yeah,
this
thank
is
you.
great
Thanks
information
so
that
much.
again I don't think most people know enough about. And taking the time to come on and explain this process is really enlightening. I mean, I don't know. I think that's probably the best word for it is just enlightening.
Yeah, I mean, happy to do it. Thank you so much. I mean, obviously, it's easier when we have people like you guys who want to sit and have the conversation and ask the questions. And but thank you, for being the voices for your people in your community and wanting to be able to get this information and know for yourself and share that. It's important for us.
Lanie, don't thank us. Flanked is here just trying to get Valkyrie.
Oh, stop.
Valkyrie nerfed. You know it. Hey, well, off air, we'll talk about that.
As long as you keep
I don't
bullying your
actually
viewers, I'm
think that
happy.
Valkyrie should be nerfed. I just don't like her personally. But I recognize that's a personal thing. I think that Valkyrie's okay. But
I will write this down and use this against you in any future
do that,
tweets
that's
against
fine.
Val.
I was gonna say it's recorded now.
Yeah.
Lanie, is it okay if we put your Twitter down below in the comment on the description? Is that okay?
Yeah,
okay,
that's
we'll
fine.
link Lanie's
Yeah,
Twitter
that's
down there, and you guys can drop her a follow over there. Again, thank you so much for coming on. For anybody watching, thanks for hanging out. Hopefully, this kind of answered some questions as far as what all goes into the balance, and also hopefully you understand now that the dev team does listen to things other than just, hey, this operator is good or bad. It's, hey, I don't enjoy playing against this operator. They're hearing that from you, and that goes into their decision making. That's really what jumps out to me from this conversation. So again, thank you so much to everybody watching. I guess we will see you on the next one, and have a good day.
Peace.
See ya.
Thank you.